Hi, class. This will be section 9, part 4 of what will be a part 5 series. We'll have one more wrap up after this. We talked about the Mexican War. I want you to go through your PowerPoint and you'll see test questions on what were Southern Fire Eaters. What was that group? Uh, we'll talk about the Fugitive Slave Act, guys. The Fugitive Slave Act was the act where they signed it where if you were a free black person and you were in the North, you could be arrested. These fugitive marshals would come in and you had to prove that you weren't a runaway slave. The Fugitive Slave Act is one of many really bad things that you'll see during this time. Uh, Guys, I always tell people when we what caused the American Civil War, and students always like to just put, well, it was slavery, it was states' rights. I think it was a lot of different things. And one of the things I've always said is lack of leadership. We just didn't have good leaders. President Millard Fillmore, this is a guy that you'll see. They go from there to the Compromise of 1850, which what they're trying to do again, these are Band-Aid programs. I'm not going to go all the way through this Compromise of 1850. You'll see it on a test question. You need to look at it on the PowerPoint, understand what it is. But then in 1852, the Whigs will begin to split along sectional lines. They'll nominate Winfield Scott, Fuss and Feathers. Remember the old general? And but he'll be defeated by a guy named Franklin Pierce. Franklin Pierce will come in. Franklin Pierce is another one of these presidents. You just don't see him do a whole lot. And again, you see me constantly looking at this PowerPoint, and that's what you guys need to do when you're studying this. He'll bring in Arizona as part of an expansion going out. That's one of the things he does. Now, we're going to talk a little bit about the Kansas Nebraska Act and what this was, and that will lead us into Stephen Douglas. Guys, the Kansas Nebraska Act is Stephen Douglas, and he'll be known as the Little Giant. I think you'll see that on a test question. It'd be a good quiz question for this, too. But what he wants to do is they're expanding Kansas and Nebraska for the railroad system. Now, what Douglas does, and this is why, guys, we can't judge guys in history too tough. What Douglas does is something I probably would have done. I'm a big person that believes, if there's a group of us and we can't make up our minds, let's have a vote. Let's vote. So Douglas says, look, the people that live in the Kansas and Nebraska area, let them vote if they want slavery or not. This is a terrible decision because pro-slavery people will come in there, anti-slavery. It will be called Bleeding Kansas. And there is a lot of violence. John Brown, we saw where John Brown coming. He'll come out of this era. Guys, our next president that will lead is a guy named James Buckingham. Buckingham is another guy that I just think he's a do-nothing president. He's there from 1857 till 1861. He was somewhat of a Southern supporter. Now, Buckingham will make the famous statement, I was as happy to leave as he was to enter, he being Lincoln. Buckingham is the guy that is very important, guys, that when this American Civil War starts off and Lincoln is elected, there's a certain amount of time before he takes office. This guy, Buckingham, James Buckingham, did nothing. Confederate forces come in, they took armories, they began to build an army. The Confederates began to build the Confederate Army, okay? The army that will lead into this war. And this guy could have tried to stop it. He didn't. He really did nothing. The last thing I want to talk about is the Dred Scott case. You'll see that on test questions. In fact, it's very important. Dred Scott had been a slave. He had been a slave of an army officer. He had gone up north, and then he had filed a lawsuit. And through this Dred Scott case goes completely through the United States Supreme Court, and it says basically he has no rights because he wasn't a citizen, because he's an African American. The Dred Scott case, guys, the thing I want you to remember is Abraham Lincoln. We think of Lincoln as this backwoodsman, this guy that's carrying an axe and he's splitting rails. A lot of that was true of Lincoln when he was younger. Guys, Lincoln was an attorney. And when Lincoln will face Stephen Douglas, this Dred Scott case is something Lincoln will consistently bring up. The Fugitive Slave Act is something Lincoln. Remember, he's an attorney. Attorneys love to use cases to case precedent to talk about. And Lincoln will do this. The Dred Scott case will be a football that Abraham Lincoln will carry all the way through this thing. I'll tell you what, well, we'll end this thing as far as Stephen Douglas and Lincoln. They will have famous debates. Lincoln will win that election, and Lincoln will prepare to go on and to lead our country into this great American Civil War. Guys, when we return, this will be, we're still on Section 9. We'll go into Part 5, an overview of what we've talked about. Remember, this thing started off with your essay. That's very important. You've got to write an essay. Who is the greatest general, Lee or Grant? You got to meet them in the Mexican-American War. They're young guys. Remember, Grant's the combat soldier. Lee works for the Corps of Engineers. They both work under Winfield Scott. They both, but the big question that we'll talk about, and this is the question that I'll really hammer home to you, is did Lee and Grant know one another before the American Civil War? Did they? That is going to be the key, I believe, to why Grant is successful. It's a simple question. And they will meet at Appomattox at the end of the war. So we'll have the conclusion to this coming up, and we'll see you guys then. Bye.